record this.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. I'm very happy to be here and to present. And I'm so happy to see the PTA is involved. And I tell folks I got my start in being involved in education from PTA. I used to be on a member of the PTA at Campbell Middle School. And I tell folks you should be very, very cautious if they're having elections not to go to the restroom, because when you get back, you may be president. And so that's how I got my start. And from there, I joined the school board in Campbell, and from there, the County Board of Education. And so certainly PTA has been very influential as far as my work in education. So I'm happy too that we have this opportunity to talk about the issues related to racism, and certainly given everything that is going on these days, there's a lot to talk about. Even as you probably, a lot of you saw the debate this past week, there were some themes that were raised that we might talk a little bit about. And so the whole idea here is to hopefully get you to think about and maybe reconsider some of the things that you have been thinking about related to race. So I'm going to switch over to my presentation here. Can everybody see that?
Not yet.
I see it on my screen. Do you see the first?
Are you sharing your screen? Because we don't see it.
Do you see the green button at the bottom of your screen that says share screen?
Let me get back. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
All right. I'll catch up with this technology. So, and who's going, am I advancing this? I'm looking for, oh, there it is. Okay. All right. So let me start by saying, first of all, as it is stating here, parenting means appreciating what you say and do are important, but even more important is who you are. And so I think that is really at the crux of how do we make sure that in our interactions with our children, that we're sending them the right message. And we can say things and we can do things, but it really has to do what is really inside of us, what's inside of our heart more than what's in our mind. And so I think that is the one of the messages I would hope that people take away from this is that you need to focus on who you are. Okay, and the objectives for the workshop, we're just going to make people more aware of some of the terminology. Sometimes the terminology can be a little bit intimidating. And so want to talk a little bit about that, some of the concepts that people may not be totally comfortable with or familiar with, have a conversation about that, and then suggest opportunities to engage the youth in dialogue. Is there anything else that anyone might want to cover as far as this presentation? You can just unmute yourself and share if you have something else that you'd like to suggest. But there'll be a couple of times for us to talk as we go through the presentation.
Leon, I do have a question, and I'm happy to save it for later. But basically, I'm troubled by community reactions around Prop 16, which PTA supports, I support, but I'm finding people suggesting that Prop 16 is racist, which is very strange to me,
Yes, yes.
but we can
Well,
save it for later.
yeah, and I think folks probably on this call are familiar with Prop 16 in that it provides an opportunity for particularly the state government to use race as a criteria to make decisions related to contracting and also entrance into, and particularly the college system. So let's talk about that in a little bit. I just thought I'd, as a way, a little bit of introduction, give you some sense of my own path. And as you see that all of this is in my lifetime. I was born in a place called Meridian, Mississippi. And in those days, if I went downtown to go to a department store, I might see something like this, where as far as up in the left-hand corner, you would see a white and colored drinking fountains. And so as a young child, you aren't quite sure what to make of some of these things. And so it's in time that you realize that there is a difference. And so all of this is not very far in the past as far as our culture is concerned. And I think all this slide really highlights the fact that we've had a lot of changes in our society over the last 50, 60 years. And so that is causing some of the problems I think that we're having right now, because a lot of change has happened in a relatively short period of time. Some of the other pictures there, if you go to the right of the drinking fountains, that is the Watts riots. I was in LA. My family moved from Mississippi to LA. And in 1965, they had the Watts riots. That whole incident started similar to what we've seen recently in some cases. There was an incident between the police and one of the people in their neighborhood. And from there, there was a riot that lasted for several days, and about 40 people were killed during that particular incident. Next to that, you'll see the Martin Luther King marching in the civil rights movement. I am old enough to remember exactly when it was announced that he had been assassinated. And I'll never forget that feeling of hearing that message. And so certainly during that particular time, we're talking about the late 60s now, that it was a very heady time for our country. And then here we have at the bottom in the left, we have the two athletes from San Jose State who did the protest at the Olympics that year. That too was a very, very tumultuous kind of a response that came from that. And so all of that during that particular time was just an indicator of what sort of the birth pains that this country was going through in trying to move from separate water drinking fountains to a society that was more inclusive. And then there is Barack Obama. And a lot of people believe that when he was elected, that was the end of race being an issue in this country. And we all know that that was not the case. But the fact that a Black man was actually elected president was in itself something that many of us thought we would never see. And so certainly that is something that is figuring into the psyche of this country right now. And in my opinion, if it wasn't for Barack Obama, we probably would not have had a Donald Trump because there's still a lot of people who believe that this country looks a certain way that does not include people of other backgrounds. And then in the far right bottom, we see one of the more recent protests after the killing of George Floyd. And all of this, I think, shows that we are in this cycle of trying to create a country that is much more diverse, where people are treated equally and all. So that is a little bit of my journey. Any questions right now as far as any of this so far? Okay, I'm going to play a little bit of a video here that talks about why should we be talking to our kids about race.
Race is one of those touchy subjects you don't really want to get into because you're afraid you might mess up. But the fact is that as early as 3 years old, children are classifying people based on their appearances. And so the worst conversation adults can have with kids about race is no conversation at all. Talking to kids about race needs to happen early, often, and honestly. Saying honestly, yeah, people are different, cultures are different, but that's a good thing. How boring would it be to have a crayon box that all had the same color? There are so many ways to approach racial conversations. You can use Dr. Seuss books, you can use any sort of pop culture reference. There are many, many movies, animated movies especially, that form a good entryway. So it's helpful, especially as a parent, to watch the movie beforehand, maybe, or read a plot summary and say, well, what's happening here? Or look at all the other princesses. What do you notice about them? Do you think anyone can be a princess? Do they have to have a certain skin color or look a certain way? And it's usually good to sort of stop along the way, pause 2 or 3 times strategically, and bring up this conversation. Kids, just like adults, don't just respond to words. So this isn't just quote unquote talking to your kids about race. This is actually experiential learning that we need to do. I remember taking a class to the Lorraine Motel where Dr. King was assassinated. And when young people see that, that impacts them. And then we can use that experience, that hands-on, visceral encounter with race and racism, to have a much more substantive conversation, and it feels different. And you can do that in your own local city. There are historical markers, those signs you pass all the time and never read. Stop and read them one day. See what they say, see what happened there, see if you recognize the names, or if you don't, go and look them up. Utilize all the resources around you and make sure that you're not just talking to your kids about race and diversity and justice, but you're showing them why it's important. Racism is detrimental to the entire society, no matter if you're Black or white, Latino, Asian, Native, whomever. Everyone is impacted, and that's why we need to raise a generation of people that's going to turn around and try to change that momentum toward the tide of anti-racism and racial justice.
And I think that video was an excellent way to sort of frame the conversation and give some ideas too. But what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about race and some of the ideas that have dominated our conversation about it. And first of all, I just want to start off with the question, what is race? And so I think a lot of us believe that it's something real, but in effect, it really is something that is constructed probably for convenience as far as being able to categorize people. But as far as the biological basis is concerned, it really is meaningless. And so it does raise the question, you know, why should we continue to use it? But obviously, it is something that has an impact as far as things like discrimination. But we should be letting our kids know that race, in effect, is not something that is meaningful in many, many different ways. I also have the question here, what is the one drop rule? Has anybody heard of that, the one drop rule? I'm trying to get back to, I can see everyone. Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. And that's, okay. Well, the one drop rule basically was something that if you're from the South, you're probably a little bit more familiar with. But what it basically said was that if you had one drop of Black blood in you, you were Black. And so even if your grandfather or grandmother, one of your grandfathers or one of your grandmothers had any Black or was Black, then that means you were. Even if you look just like every other white person, you were still Black. And so that was the tradition that we had in this country that is still in the minds of a lot of people. And so this is one of the ideas that we have to address as far as what does this actually mean as far as race. And I think in a lot of ways, it just shows how irrelevant the whole concept of race is if somebody is judged based on the fact of the racial background of a grandparent. Another term is the whole issue of racism. And I think we all assume what racism is, but it certainly is the perspective that somehow one group is inherently superior to another group. And secondly, it has to do with power. Doesn't make much difference if you think one group, if your group is inherently superior, if your group has no power, the other group will not, it won't matter. But it's power that really makes the difference. And in our culture, we do have one group that has more power. And based on that, there's a sense of superiority. One of the interesting questions, and I think it goes a little bit to the question about Prop 16. The question is, can African Americans be racist? Does anybody want to comment in regards to that? You know, I'm not able to get back to the screen where I'm seeing everybody for some reason. All I can see is the presentation. But I'll keep going here since I believe you can see me. Can African Americans be racist? Well, in some people's eyes, the answer is no, because African Americans do not have power in this country. And so only those people who are in power can be racist. I assume that in some particular cases, you could have African American who would discriminate, given that definition, but for a lot of people, as long as African Americans don't have power, then therefore they can't discriminate. So I think to the question on Proposition 16, what it would suggest is that if you have a Prop 16 and you have a means by which people who are not in power, whether it's Latinx or African Americans, by providing them some kind of preference to allow them to get into universities or have contracts, that's not racist because, in effect, Latinx and African Americans do not have power. They don't have the power now to address those issues. And so therefore, it's not racist. Now, that probably is a more kind of a philosophical argument than most people are going to be able to digest. At least a lot of people won't be able to digest. And a lot of people are going to say that it is racist if you make your decisions on that basis. But just to provide an opportunity for some feedback, I'd appreciate you sharing with me how you're feeling about that question about, is something like Proposition 16 racist? Mr. Martin, do you have an idea?
Well, let me say just a little more about what I've been seeing and hearing around here. There are lawn signs against Prop 16 that say, "Don't divide us." But it's interesting that the message that I'm hearing from people who oppose it is that Prop 16 discriminates against people of Asian ancestry. And it's only certain groups, people with ancestry from specific countries, who have this idea. So I think the idea spreads within groups. And I'm kind of at a loss to talk to people about the issues because their mind made up. And I just don't know what to do with the whole thing.
Okay. And anybody else?
No,
go ahead.
I should add one thing. Are you familiar with there's a paper by someone named Bleemer out of UC Berkeley?
No.
Recent paper, I think it's from September. That's the first large-scale analysis of the effects of Prop 209. And the conclusion was that Prop 209 did a great deal of damage to kids and families whose ancestors ultimately come from either, well, mostly Africa, but also perhaps Latin America, but didn't actually benefit other groups in any significant way. But there's so much competition now for places like Berkeley that that people seem to have very rigid attitudes about it, and I find it very troubling.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have any comments in regards, particularly Prop 16? Yeah, I wondered when I first heard that they were going to put this on the ballot, how this was going to go over, because as you say, even before Prop 16, there were some folks in the Asian community who were complaining that there was discrimination. And if you look at it on a purely merit basis, there should be even a higher number of Asian Americans in places like Berkeley, UCLA, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And so when I heard that this was going to be on the ballot, I wondered what would be the reaction in that regard. Mm-hmm. And I think it's been kind of split. I think the Asian caucus actually is in favor of Prop 16. But there are other Asian groups who are against it for obvious reasons. I think what they are saying about dividing us there's probably some truth in that, but we were divided anyway. And so I'm not sure what kind of, how do you resolve the issue by not doing anything? And so this at least tries to do something that will sort of level a playing field and I think the evidence is there that as far as particularly when you talk about UCs, there are far fewer African Americans and Latinx folks who are there now versus before. So,
Mhm.
so yeah, it will be interesting to see how this all resolves. I think the latest polling showed that the no vote was probably a little bit ahead right now, but we'll have to see how it all turns out. Any comments, questions? Okay, so another term we always hear about is systemic or institutional racism. And that's sort of what we were just talking about with Prop 16. It tries to address the institutional racism. And basically, this is a definition for the institutional racism, where the normal practices within a society basically lead to discrimination in certain areas. And certainly we see that in the criminal justice system, employment, housing, and a whole lot of other areas. But yet a lot of the whole idea of systemic or institutional racism is questioned. I've in the debates that we've had, I think that the president believes that there's no such thing as systemic racism. I'm not sure what evidence he's looking at to come to that conclusion, but certainly there's enough information to suggest that something is going on that leads to unequal outcomes for certain people. And so I think we have to address that, and we have to take it on face first to address the issue, or else we'll continue to have a divided country. And then we have unconscious or implicit bias. And I have a video we'll show a little bit later about this, but a lot of our institutions who are trying to address some of the biases that goes on have instituted programs to address this issue. I don't know, has the county office had any programs on implicit or unconscious bias, Yi?
Yes, actually, this year, all employees are required to attend an online training on implicit bias. And also in our professional learning and instructional services division, we have many professional development, like we integrate implicit bias and unconscious bias into our professional learning opportunities for teachers.
Right, okay. That is good to hear. And I don't know, do you have any insight as far as how it has impacted the organization?
The organization that you're referring to, the County Office of Education, right?
Correct.
Internally, it brings a greater awareness about our actions and our behaviors. So we want to, before we make any decisions, it's great for the leaders, especially amongst the leadership team, to really think about what might be some potential impact of our decision or our actions on our students and on our stakeholders. So definitely it is an attempt, a strong effort in integrating the self-awareness piece into our daily practice.
And the self-awareness piece is key. And so I don't think many of us realize some of the things that we do unconsciously. And I'm sort of building on my work as a therapist and us understanding that oftentimes those behaviors that we have are quite, the reasons for them are unknown, and we're not even aware in many cases. So what the training tries to do is make us aware of some of the things that are, that in a way, have become instinctive. I'm going to give you a little bit of advice that I wish I could have given the president in his debate the other night. At one particular point, he said that he is the least racist person in the room. And I've heard him say that before. And so what I would have told the president is that, you know, whenever anyone says that, it usually is a sign that they're racist. And so, because racism oftentimes is something that people are not even aware of. So by you saying that you're not, a lot of times it's just evidence that you're not aware, and there's a chance that you're a racist. And so I think for those of us who have had to exist in this culture, we see those kinds of things, and it sort of sets off a red light, a warning light in regards to how this, what this person is really saying. And it's certainly a factor in education. And there's been research done that you could have a teacher in a classroom and they will respond differently for some kids who are of one color versus the kids of a different color. And they are totally unaware of it. And they have done these recordings and been able to show how this happens all of the time. And so all of the training that we're doing as far as implicit bias is trying to make people aware that unbeknownst to them, they are doing things that impact whoever that they're working with. It could be students, it could be coworkers, et cetera. So unconscious and implicit bias is something that we're going to have to be working on for a long, long time. And so it certainly would suggest we need to be more comfortable in understanding the nature of the problem. And I'm going to show a short video that talks a little bit about unconscious bias and also systemic racism.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire Black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny Black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, Black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the Black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
I think this particular presentation certainly provides some insight around education and why some schools look different than other schools. And I'm working now over at Overfeld High School, which is on the east side of San Jose. And Overfeld looks a lot different than if you go to the west side of the valley in some of the high schools over there. And most people will tell you that the kind of education that you're going to get on one side of the valley is different than the other side. So is that racism, or is that systematic racism, or what? What do you think? Amelia?
It's a lot to do with where you live, education, money, housing, income. All of those play into what's going on from the east side to the west side. That has a lot to do with it.
Mm-hmm. And does race play into that too?
Of course it does.
Yeah, yeah. Any other comments about the video?
Leon, this is Diane. I thought it was probably one of the better ones I've seen. And in fact, I was going to ask if people are going to be able to get a copy of your presentation, because I think it can be used, or at least a lot of the videos can be used by others.
Right.
And
right.
so even a list of the videos would be wonderful.
Right.
But I think really what it came down to was that it was all the redlining. People decided where people of color were going to live. And even real estate agents wouldn't show, like I've lived in Palo Alto, and in Palo Alto for years, if you were anything but white, you were not shown a house to buy, except for finally one man bought a plot of land and would only sell to people who were not white. And so I think the whole problem in our schools, a large part of it is we designated areas where we were going to slot people. And the housing prices and Prop 13 didn't help either, made it so that you do have a significant difference in how our children are taught. I mean, I remember years ago when Eastside Union was talking about having to drop down to 5 classes. So it is, the children of today are paying for the issues of the past.
Mm.
And I'm not sure how long it will take to get that taken care of.
Well, I think in the current terms, what it does suggest too is understanding what you just said, then it certainly would suggest that something like Prop 16, there should be some understanding of the challenge that we're trying to address. And therefore, yes, it may seem like it is racism, but on the other hand, it was that those same attitudes that put a lot of us, a lot of people of color in the position that they're in. And so to ignore the issue is certainly not going to solve it. And so unfortunately, I don't think most people have been in forums like this or any other forums that have these kinds of discussions about what is really happening in our society. I do want to show one more video, and I want to get your opinion of it. Excuse the quality of some of it, but I think it's very effective in making a point around how implicit bias is instilled within particularly our children.
Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because he's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me.
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one.
Okay.
That doll.
Is she the bad child?
Because he's black.
And why is he the ugly child?
Because he looks like he's white.
Why is he the dumb child?
Because he has dark brown skin.
Why is she the bad child?
Because she makes fun of everybody else's skin color.
Show me the child who has the skin color most adults like. And show the child who has the skin color most adults don't like.
Dumb child.
Okay, why is she the dumb child?
Because she has black skin.
Show me the mean child. Why is he the mean child?
Because she's brown.
Show me the bad child. Why is he the bad child?
Because she's black.
Okay. Show me the ugly child. Why is he the ugly child?
Because she's brown, black.
¿Cuál es bonito? ¿Cuál muñeco es feo? ¿Cuál muñeco es malo?
Ninguno.
¿Cuál muñeco es malo?
Este.
¿Y por qué?
Porque, bueno, este es moreno y este es blanco.
¿Cuál muñeco es feo? ¿Por qué?
Porque a mí no me gusta el color café.
¿Cuál muñeco te gusta más?
Este.
¿Cuál muñeco es bueno?
Este.
¿Y por qué?
Porque no me dan miedo los güeros porque tengo más confianza con si los un poco más así como este. No tengo mucha confianza.
¿Cuál muñeco es malo? ¿Por qué?
No sé.
¿Cuál muñeco es feo?
Este. No sé, es que me parece que está un poquito, ¿cómo te diría? Más moreno y no se ve tan blanco. Y no tiene mucho aspecto And can you show me the doll that looks bad? Okay. And can you give, and why does that look bad? Because it's black. And why do you think that's a nice doll? Because she's white. And can you give me the doll that looks like you?
You know, I don't know how this particular video affects you, but it certainly bothers me. Um, both from the perspective that here you have children who may be white, who are already believing certain things about kids who have dark skin. And just as bad as the fact that you have some kids who have dark skin, who are African American, who don't see themselves as positively as other kids who have white or light skin. And that is still an issue today. And I see it in our schools with our own children and their own self-perceptions. And those perceptions affect not only how they do in school, but also emotionally how well they do. And so, any comments? Now, we have one person whose name I don't see who hasn't commented yet.
Leon, I have a comment. That video is always disturbing to me. It gives me chills, makes my hair and my arm curl. I'm a mom of a son and a daughter, and I always looked for the dolls of color. They were very difficult to find then, and they're still very difficult to find now. So that's the first dilemma of trying to find something that looks like them.
Right.
And then after, or if you can find something that looks like them, to explain to them how beautiful that particular doll is. And it's the same on TV. It's the same in the books. It's the same everywhere, where there's still not enough identity of something that looks like you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Leon?
Any other comments in regards to the video?
Leon, at what age do kids start to have these reactions?
Well, you know, in the first video we saw, it stated that as early as age 3, kids sort of know the difference. They start perceiving certain things. And so after that, then they start associating certain values related to those differences. So we're talking about, and as you saw in those kids in this movie, we're talking about kids who are just entering school. So at a very, very early age.
Okay, we are about to going back to the main room. We have like 10 seconds left in here.
10 seconds?
Yes.
Okay, well, obviously we won't be able to get to some of these, but let me just say that here, as far as tips for parents, you do need to be mindful of what your kids are seeing and making sure that when things happen, and this has to be experiential. You can't sit down and have a lecture to your kids about it, but you have to be constantly vigilant when those situations come up where you see that there's some discrimination going on, to point that out to your kids. And you have to face your own biases, because we all have them, and we need to be aware of those so we don't pass those on to our kids. this presentation will be available to finish these tips, but I'll just finish with the last one that said a plan for a marathon and not a sprint. This is not something you're going to next week or within the next year.